This is the biggest problem. It's not balance of payment issues. Balance of payment issues are a consequence of this problem. We just don't have talent of all kinds: music, politics, arts, science, economics, you name it. The best leave and they take flight. It's a big problem.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. Guyana has been in the headlines recently for many reasons. Today we are going to be talking about the economic potential of the new oil industry in the country. Does Guyana have enough institutional sophistication to translate the oil revenue into a meaningful growth program for the country? To tackle this question, I am joined by Collin Constantine. He was born and raised in Guyana and is now an assistant professor and fellow of economics at the University of Cambridge. Let's dive in. Hi, Colin, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Rashid. First, thank you for the invitation, and let me apologize to your listeners. I'm fighting a bit of a cold here, so my voice might be on and off.
So I want to jump right into Guyana. Now, for various reasons, Guyana has been topical, not necessarily or for the best things, the Guyana Venezuela issues and so on, but also for the recent oil boom that Guyana is going to be experiencing in a few years. And very often people assume that, okay, here is the magic bullet to all the economic problems that Guyana has been going through for the last few decades. Do you actually see it as a clear positive for Guyana to find so much of a fiscal windfall so quickly?
It's a positive in one important sense. It would allow us to deal with many of the living standard issues: compensation, public servants, wages in the private sector. We would be able to build lots of public capital goods. Think of infrastructure, clean water, improve our healthcare and education. These things are very important, but capital is not going to allow us to build our institutional infrastructure, strengthen institutions along the lines of diversity, inclusion, strengthen democracy. We have a major problem every 5 years when it comes to the electoral cycle, and this might actually make that worse rather than strengthen those particular issues.
Why would you say would make it worse? What are the dynamics in Guyana that people don't know about? I know there's one particular dynamic that is, even to me, it's a bit surprising from the outside, is the ethnic tension dynamic in the country where the population is very small, it's around less than 800,000 people in Guyana, in a country that's bigger than England, geographically speaking. But there is this still ethnic tension. Could you give some sense of how that plays out politically?
All right, look, since the discovery of Guyana and the importation of labor from India and other parts, and of course the slave trade was a big part of the origin of the Guyana story, we've had a kind of resource competition between Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese. Why? Because these are the two major ethnic groups, and we vote along lines of race. This is well documented in scholarship. So every election is the ethnic census. The migration rates by ethnicity is very important. And since the return of democracy, and by that I mean voting every 5 years, that's all I mean by democracy. And we've had the PPP winning political office, which is primarily supported by Indo-Guyanese. The last election was 2020 during COVID. And of course, the government who win that election would be able to spend, for the first time, major windfall from oil. So what happened in 2020 is that there was a blatant attempt, clear as day. Of course, you can live stream the election. You can see it on Facebook and other social media. And we saw on Facebook a blatant attempt to change the votes right before our eyes. And of course, we all expected something. We didn't necessarily expect it to be that blatant, right? So this is the kind of things we expect at pretty much every election, right? There'll be some attempt to rig. And because the stakes are high, if you lose elections in Guyana, you're almost locked out of political decision making. And that's just because of the parliamentary system. If you have a majority of one seat in parliament, then the opposition is there only for aesthetics.
What do you mean by its latent attempt to change votes? Because I am actually not too keyed into the election cycle in Guyana. I do remember there was a period of time for a few months in the last election where it was very uncertain where the count landed. What was the actual drama there?
One employee of the Guyana Elections Commission was doing his job and he was counting the votes, and it was being verified by all political participants. Then he fell ill, he was taken to the hospital, and the voting stopped. Of course, many political parties asked the GCOM Election Commission to appoint a new staff to continue the count. That did not happen. Upon his return from hospital, he decided to declare elections, but the count was not complete. And of course, that led to an injunction in the courts and the beginning of 5 months of lots of political massaging as it relates to dealing with elections. Eventually, after 5 months, lots of pressure from the United States and other bodies, the counting deed was concluded. We even recounted election under the governance of some CARICOM selected members, and ultimately the PPP was declared.
I see. Okay. So in this context, have a fairly, let's say, weak democratic institutions in Guyana. It's not that different from other Caribbean countries, to be clear. But where do you see it as a matter of there's going to be serious effort towards institutional credibility or gaining more credibility in the institutions now that they do have a lot more firepower from the oil sales? Or is it a matter of we might be expecting a bit too much from a fragile state?
This is a great question, and any meaningful answer to the question has to rely, I think, less on Guyana, because who knows what the future is, right? We have to rely on previous experience. We know that similarly divided countries in Africa, for example, who were able to discover some natural resource, whether it's oil, gold, or whatever it is. And of course, their issue might be less ethnic, it might be more tribal related in other parts of the world. But we do not see these kinds of bridges being built or extended in those type of countries. Typically, these ethnic divisions become sharper. Typically, we use the windfall gains to strengthen our ethnic support or tribal support to almost guarantee. And indeed, for a decade or two, you do guarantee electoral victory. For example, I do not expect, and I don't think anyone who pays attention to politics in Guyana expects the current government to lose election next year or indeed in the next 10 years. It's just too much money. You can throw it around. Of course, these things matter for the political cycle, right? But I'm very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic about Guyana's future along these lines. The government of the day has increased its expenditure with the new budget for 2024 by 60%. I think it's the first budget that is $1 trillion. And it's a lot of money. This is exactly what we observe in other parts of the world. And this is usually how we get the so-called natural resource curse or the political resource curse, if you will. And it's just a lot of money. Next year's election. So I'm not surprised that we're spending this kind of money. But again, these things are not pointing us in the right direction, I think. And as it relates to the tone of the political debate, as it relates to the substantive issues of ethnic differences, as it relates to the issues of the distribution of income across ethnicities and class, I don't think we've made any progress in that direction. Right now, it's clear the government is focused on building infrastructure, and that's very important. It's just that these things are equally important, if not more important, as it relates to the long-term growth and development.
Is there a meaningful wealth difference between the Afro-Guyanese and the Indo-Guyanese community?
We don't have data to answer that question. We don't have data to answer that question. I've recently published a paper a couple months ago on that question as it relates to income. What I could say in terms of ethnicities, I could say that class inequality is greater than ethnic inequality. But Indo-Guyanese indeed are overrepresented in the top 10% of the income distribution. Afro-Guyanese are overrepresented in the bottom 90% of the income distribution. In other words, let's say there are 10 apples and that makes you a member of the 10%, 7 of those apples might go to Indo-Guyanese, even though they might be 30% of the population. That's what we know about the distribution of income across the ethnicities. Indo-Guyanese are indeed overrepresented in the top class, but it also means they are underrepresented in the bottom 90% of the income distribution. So this ethnic tension really might simply be a within-class conflict, meaning it's really the Indo-Guyanese elites and the Afro-Guyanese elites that are really trying to compete for dominance of the top 10%. And of course, the tools through which they engage in that battle has to do with the mass support base of each ethnic.
So let's broaden this a bit to the grouping. So CARICOM, which means Caribbean Community for those who need context, is a very loose connection of Caribbean governments that tries to do some kind of regulatory coordinating and a bit more for the Caribbean as a whole. I know that there are some announcements between, for example, recently between Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana to start a new inter-island ferry system. I know there were some announcements last year, and there were only announcements last year about some general quote food security development. Again, with Guyana, new President Ali trying to lead that kind of cause. And you see those kind of conversations going in and out all the time. I do wonder with Guyana now becoming a very state wealthy country, much more than many other Caribbean countries would have been. Do you see Guyana trying to push its weight a bit more in CARICOM, and given the headquarters is in itself, and I wonder what effects that will have on CARICOM as a coordinating system.
Well, look, talent and capital, by that I mean money, tends to go where the power is. And for the moment, Guyana is where all the excitement is. So indeed, I do expect lots of highly talented Caribbean people that can find some employment either in the private sector or specifically in the oil sector to find their way into the Guyanese labor market. The same is true for capital. Recently, meaning I think a week ago, CARICOM leaders, including the president and vice president of Guyana, met in Jamaica to discuss capital market union or capital market integration. Things are certainly pointing in that direction. Indeed, Guyana will be at the forefront. That's great for Guyana. That's great for the Caribbean if people are able to better employ their capital or their talents. I'm concerned about what that might mean for polarization within the community. So that's on the one hand, this is great for the Caribbean movement. On the other hand, it might also sow the seeds of disintegration if we don't manage these flows in an equitable way.
Could you expand on that? What kind of variables do you think would sow those seeds of disintegration? From my perspective, CARICOM has not been particularly useful as any kind of mechanism. I still have, let's say, illusions that it could become useful. Maybe that's a good or bad thing. But what in this particular dynamic do you think will actually push you apart?
You're going to have to forgive this answer. I'm going to have to start a little bit with history. So look, the motivation or the model that CARICOM is trying to emulate is the EU model. Now, the EU model has a logic. The logic is we need to remove tariffs and barriers to trade, and we need to integrate and perhaps share a common currency. Behind that, though, is that they had key players, particularly Germany at the time, that is a major export powerhouse. So they had things to trade as well. This community had things to trade within the group. This is not the case per se in the Caribbean. So we need a different model. And there's lots of debate. There's lots of debate about the so-called implementation deficit. And the blame is placed squarely at the feet of CARICOM headquarters and sometimes the political leaders of the member states. But what we don't include in that analysis is the fact that it might be that if we indeed were to fully operationalize CARICOM as presently envisioned, it might lead to significant inequities. Specifically, it might lead to lots of trade deficits for some member states and major trade surplus for other member states. It might simply lead to one country indeed taking all the talent. It might lead to private sector capital going disproportionately to one country. So the growth might be lopsided, so to speak. And how do you deal with those problems? So those are not problems in themselves if we have a community level agreement to redistribute some of these things. But we don't have that. The EU does not have that. And that's why they're in the problem they're in as it relates to the Eurozone. So that's what I mean about seeds of disintegration. You must remember that it might have been 2016, I can't recall the year now, that Jamaica pretty much threatened to leave. And we need to ask why that is. And they always have lots of issues with Trinidad. For example, they think lots of their dollars that are really in Jamaica are deliberately being siphoned off into Trinidad. Guyana made similar claims as well. So those are some of the issues that we need to address frontally. We need to be aware of some of these intra-community distributional outcomes for whatever we decide to do at the community level. That's the reason we haven't implemented any of these measures. And that's if you agree that these measures really are in the interest of the community. I think we really need to reevaluate the claim that if we were to remove barriers to trade, that somehow this would cause firms to invest, this would cause growth in these countries, and be able to export more. We need to certainly reevaluate that claim. We need a model of integration that is more suited for countries at our stage of development. We just can't simply look at the European model and say, yeah, that's the example. And we must remember, we tried the European model in developing countries in other parts of Africa and other parts of Latin America. And just like CARICOM, it's a big debate about implementation deficit.
Let's stick on this for a bit. How accurate really is it to say that the CARICOM model, it looks to the EU model as some kind of motivating factor? I do know, for example, a very specific layer in CARICOM competition law. A lot of the competition law was essentially modeled, this is a very strong word, essentially modeled, off of the EU competition law, but with extreme omissions in many ways. Remember, when the competition law was first implemented and passed under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, there was an exception saying non-profit companies are actually excluded from competition laws. Like weird things like that, eventually they were fixed. But it really doesn't seem to me that the CARICOM leaders have any conviction that CARICOM really should be a thing that should exist. The mere fact you have Jamaica not too long ago thinking they should leave is, I know you wrote about this, but in one way, it's like, what if Jamaica did leave CARICOM? What actually would be the effect of that? It doesn't seem like it would have a noticeable effect in the short or long term, given there's so little actual engagement with it as a group.
All right. Substantively, you're right. In terms of the economy and all that, there'd be very little effect. Of course, there'll be a major hit to national pride or regional pride, rather. That would be the hit. And I think you're right. I don't think member states find much purpose in CARICOM other than perhaps free movement of labor when you travel within the region, that sort of thing, common passport, a common voice when we try to negotiate, if we're able to find that common voice when we try to negotiate trade agreements, how we vote in the UN, the functional cooperation component, I think member states do appreciate. But you're right, as it relates to the textbook thing of trade, integrating finance, integrating business, or creating business in other countries, certainly we're not seeing that kind of consensus. And look, we should acknowledge that if you read the press and if you buy what's written in the press, sometimes a Trinidadian might go to Jamaica and try to open a business, but it's not so easy. The Jamaicans are not so keen. And this is a fact, as I said, if you put any credence in these articles. And we need to ask why. It could be that the Jamaican private sector thinks that their market is small enough and their returns are small enough. And now we have Trinidadian competition coming in. So we need to account for some of those dynamics. It might be short-sighted, but at least we need to interrogate these issues. We just can't simply say that we're disinterested in integration, we don't have full commitment, we're not serious. Jamaica gave the community 5 years. That's not a realistic timeline to do anything. 5 years to make it fully operational. And this is my question that I asked in the article that I wrote. If CSME is fully operational, what will be the community-wide distribution? Do we know? Who's going to benefit more or less? Are we all going to benefit equally? If we can prove that we're all going to benefit equally, I think it's a no-brainer. I think member states will sign up tomorrow. My hunch is we have some guesses about who will benefit the most from a fully functional CSME, and we're not happy with those redistribution. I think that's the key issue. Of course, if you have things to sell in CARICOM, a fully functional CSME is a good thing for you. If you are producing lots of beverages, lots of snacks, lots of processed foods, and the community is going to give you an advantage relative to imports in selling those goods in the region, then yes, a fully functional CSME is great for Trinidad. It's great for light manufacturing in Guyana. And if you're on the other side of that, where you have to pay and consume, and you're paying in dollars too, you're paying in scarce dollars, and it's all going to the exporter, in this case, maybe Trinidad, maybe Guyana. We have to deal with these issues clearly and fronted. We have them. And that's a big issue. Perhaps we should think of a new currency to do interregional trade. But I should emphasize that interregional trade is very small, nonetheless. And even though it's very small, it's highly contentious politically.
To provide some more context to people listening, CARICOM doesn't even agree as a bloc on who China is. And I find that point to be very important because even when it comes to foreign policy, the CARICOM is really the only call of government coordinating mechanism in the world that doesn't actually agree on who China is. And I find that particularly point alone is a good example of the strangeness of CARICOM in itself.
I think in this case, geography is destiny, though. I think when it comes down to it, the Caribbean region are within the North American bloc. But South America, since Latin America is either the prefix or the end of some prefix. And I think ultimately that will determine where people vote when substantive matters are being discussed. But you're right, for the present moment, yeah, we don't have consensus on that either.
So Guyanese currency is actually quite, to put it mildly, weak. And it has been that way for some time. I'm curious if you have a insight of why is the Guyanese currency still so weak all this time, and why hasn't the government drastically done some policy to change that?
The government of Guyana envisions its relatively weak currency as a problem. I think as it relates to the currency, they will be concerned about the price and how fast it changes. There's been a de facto policy to try to keep it relatively stable to $1 or 2.8 to $1. But I don't think government is concerned about its relative weakness. And of course, we shouldn't be concerned one way or the other whether currency is weak or strong per se.
We should. It gives people a disadvantage when it comes to consumption overseas.
That's the whole idea of stabilizing the rate. Stabilizing the rate. Sure, we could appreciate the currency and make imports cheaper in local currency terms, but that might create another problem, that you swell the demand for imports and then you run out of scarce foreign exchange. So in that sense, a weak currency might be an advantage in trying to curb import demand.
We've mentioned several times in this conversation about weak currencies, about scarce foreign currency for interregional trade, and so on. But these are not facts of the universe. These are contingencies of how policy has been designed. In my view, if Caribbean countries, Guyana in this case, if all Caribbean countries were to get rid of their domestic currencies and just adopt, let's say, the US dollar in this instance as the sole currency, meaning the currency used internationally would be normalized to the currency used domestically, then these kind of issues would dissolve itself quite quickly. That's my assumption. Why not do that? That seems like a very straightforward thing to do.
Of course, indeed, if we were to dollarize tomorrow, we will get fewer balance of payment problems, right? We would go to the IMF on fewer occasions. We would have to suffer the indignity of being told every 10 years, almost as a rule or a law, that, yeah, this is how you keep your house in order. You need to live within your means. Presently, the fact that we have independent currencies means that we could breach the fact that we need to live within our means. So we've been doing that every 10 years. So we solve a lot of problems. But one of the reasons why we have independent currencies is because we're still attached emotionally to the independence mandate, the political independence mandate. Remember, your own currency is symbolic. I think that was one of the motivations. And the other motivation was with your own currency, you could dictate how much you spend and where you spend it. You're not necessarily subject to the influences of the world market. At least this was the ambition. This was the expectation. We have some data now. We have 4 or 5 years of data of how we run our economies, the performance of economies, with this symbolism of sovereignty and independence. And indeed, the record is mixed and perhaps has been very generous. As I said, every 10 years, almost as a rule, countries in the region have to go to the IMF and suffer the indignity of being told how to manage our affairs. We do know how to manage our affairs. It's just that it's the political business cycle, really. And if we were to remove that, we will solve lots of our problems. But that's a decision that is not just within the remit of political operatives. I think that needs to go to popular debate. People need to have a say.
Why is that? That's a curious take on how that should process.
As I said, because of the symbolism component, because of the pride component. The flip side of that coin is, in a sense, people have already made a decision. People have already voted. At least some. We already use the dollar de facto in terms of exchange. You go to Bahamas, you can certainly spend the dollar without difficulty. In Jamaica, they already decided to save in the dollar. You can even take out loans in dollars. So some people have already voted. It's clear for some people in the Caribbean where they stand on dollarization. I think for the others, it's either that they're uninformed or indeed they are attached to the symbolism of sovereignty and independence. I can think of many people who would be seriously opposed to dollarization just because of what it means. It means we're giving up the ghost. We couldn't do it on our own.
I always found that particular rationalization for domestic currencies to be the strangest one, and especially in Caribbean countries where people routinely know that perhaps a class thing also, because people that actually travel that know that go into the world understands that you can't use domestic currency in a real way. They also even don't physically use currency. They use their debit card or credit card. They have no concept what's behind the credit card, debit card. They don't touch it and that's what cash anymore. And then a lower class who are more domestically centric and mostly use cash, even the Caribbean is going down also. They have this idea of symbolism and so on, but still not too strong because if you ask them, hey, if you want to save some money, would you prefer to save in USD or Jamaican dollars? They're always going to choose USD. So it is this weird like preference falsification that comes up when you ask people about dollarization all the time. And if you just go down to some latent variable, they always just say, get rid of the actual domestic currency. It's actually hurting my life and let's use dollars. But on the larger conversation, it always comes up. The symbolism thing always comes up.
Just to strengthen that point, and this is a joke really, even the Russian oligarchs prefer to save in dollars. They don't trust Putin either. There's lots of interesting research about offshore wealth. And Russia is the top 5 countries with offshore wealth. What does that mean? They too want to hold dollars, not the Russian ruble, for example. And look, I think if we really were to have a referendum or a public debate on dollarization in the Caribbean, you're going to get strong debates on both sides. You're going to have people very passionate about this is the last relic of the independence movement. So I can think of some people saying, we've already lost cricket. CARICOM is a non-starter. People are already speaking Yankee, even though they never left the shores. And now we have the dollar, we're fully Americanized now. We already consume American, we dress American. I can certainly think of those arguments being made. But if we were to listen to those points, they're making a strong argument for why we perhaps should dollarize, because we're dollarized in every other regard too. It's an interesting mental box, but it is a debate I think we should have. We should have it in the press, at the universities, at the schools, absolutely. And because it allows us to provide some accountability for our performance since political independence. We must be clear that when government monetizes, that's a policy choice. When that leads to balance payment issues, when you hire 5,000 people today to win an election, and then you need to fire 15 in a year's time, that's a policy choice. That's domestic. And perhaps if we could resolve some of our political economy issues, I might have a different thing to say about dollarization. But we have our allegiances to the facts, or we haven't done a good job at managing it.
You mentioned that in Jamaica, I think you were working on some research on this point, that a lot of the banking sector or the financial sector has already been substantially dollarized. Is that one of the points you made?
Yeah. So lots of Jamaicans save in dollars. You can open a bank account now, a deposit, save an account in dollars. If you are a small, medium-sized firm or indeed a large one, you could choose to borrow loans denominated in dollars. That happens already. And Jamaica is not an exception. You can do that in Belize. You can do that in certain to varying extents. And of course, we know throughout the Caribbean, you can spend in dollars. So we are partially dollarized. That is technically correct. Others might argue we're fully dollarized in our heads, but that's another conversation. You perhaps need another expert for that. Yeah. So we're already dollarizing savings in Jamaica, certainly.
In Guyana, how prominent is the use of USD in like financial operations?
Not very prominent pre-oil. I do know now that some foreign companies are granted special accounts that they could hold dollar accounts, right? Because they don't want to have to require, I don't know, 1 million, 2 million, whatever it is, US dollars, and they can't find it at the moment's notice. So there are some foreign companies that have that privilege. But for 99% of households and firms now, it's local currency denominated liabilities and assets.
I see. Okay.
But that might change. Lots of people are going to become very wealthy in Guyana currency. And just like the Russian oligarchs, they're going to want to diversify into other assets. Fixed assets at home, but of course, they're going to want to hold US dollars as well.
That's right. Of course, of course. I still want to discuss some of the aspects of the oil and the institutions in Ghana because when people always ask me about it, of course, in their mind, they're thinking, okay, Guyana is going to be a Norway. And in my head, I'm thinking Guyana might be Angola because unfortunately, if to be Norway, you need a lot of Norwegians as a very short in Guyana. And I'm curious if in your view, the current administration, current government, and the policies that they are perhaps getting in place gives you confidence in some of the, let's say, fiscal developments in Guyana in next, let's say, very short term, let's say 3 years or so. You mentioned infrastructure is being built. How is that actually being built fast enough and so on?
Or if it's being built at top quality. Let me respond starting with that point. We have social media personalities. We have successful businessmen in the entertainment sector. And by entertainment, I mean they're able to bring in Caribbean artists, for example, and hold concerts. Very successful, very important work. But these kinds of entrepreneurs, these kinds of talent, social media talent, talk show hosts, they're now winning contracts to build public infrastructure. Right? Do you know what I mean? Of course, the immediate pushback to any concern is I don't need to. There was a CEO in the United States in one of the US Congress hearings said he doesn't need to be an expert in anything. He just hires the expert. And this has been the typical response. And I think in the United States, that's a reasonable response when indeed that's the norm, that people hire talent and that they have talent. In countries like ours, I don't think that excuse or that response is adequate. So that's one immediate concern as it relates to the quality of public infrastructure. As it relates to fiscal performance, look, all the official numbers look good because there's lots of money coming in the country. It's difficult to really ramp up debt to GDP ratio. It's difficult to see ballooning deficit. So how I would choose to answer that question is down the road. So we're spending lots of money now. And if we're not building infrastructure that will allow us to earn more in the future, particularly hard currency, then we certainly might be in a major fiscal problem going forward. Rather than fiscal issue, Rashid, I'm more interested in the foreign exchange market. The standard thing is there's a multiplier effect when you spend on GDP, but there's also a multiplier effect on foreign exchange. Though we're getting, I don't know, let's just give an example. Though we're getting 1 million US, when we spend, the demand might be more than 1 million US. So you can easily get into a excess demand scenario or foreign exchange shortage issue. And that is indeed, if you read the press in Guyana, that is one of the big concerns. The third thing I would want to raise as it relates to the fiscal balance is what it means for Inflation, domestic driven inflation. Lots of inflation is imported, but lots does not mean everything is imported. You can't import construction services. You can't import entertainment services and the like. There are things that are priced just domestically independent of the world market. And when lots of income rise overnight and we can't increase domestic capacity, these things have major issues for inflation. Now, the government released, I think it was on Monday, that inflation rate for last year is 2%. Now, I don't know any Guyanese who buys that number. I'm not saying that number is wrong, but if you were to talk to people, that's certainly not how they feel. They think the number is double digits based on the things that they buy. I'm doing some work. I haven't gone very far at the moment, but that's something I want to address. I want to feel behind that 2%, given the fiscal injection since 2020.
So, talent is a latent part of the conversation we mentioned earlier, but this is, I think, a big problem in Guyana. I read, I believe, years ago, I don't know if it's still accurate, actually, you might know better, that it's like 85% of all the graduates in Guyana
89.
into and they leave Guyana. That is a big problem for a country that's going to be industrializing or essentially developing and wants to develop quickly. How do you see that being corrected in a way to make it possible to do all these things in Guyana?
So first of all, this is not a Guyana specific problem. This is a CARICOM specific problem. And it is the biggest problem. Foreign exchange is very important. But let's think of foreign exchange issues as perhaps short run proximate. The core issue, you're right, is talent. And maybe if we had more talent, we would be able to manage our independent currencies better. Maybe if we had more talent, we would be able to strengthen our institutional framework. Now, remember the point I made earlier about some of these businessmen reacting by saying they're going to hire the experts. But think about what you just said. Where are the experts? They're not within the country. We have a major problem retaining talent. Many people think that with the oil discovery and boom, talent will return. Many think that talent would choose to stay. But if you were to use the amount of people at the passport office, I think it's the same as it was pre-oil. So people are still leaving. People are still leaving. We must be very clear about that. And why is that? Look, when you have talentless people in positions of power, they tend not to be very good leaders. I have lots of friends and colleagues in the public sector, in private sector, and they just do not feel valued, Rashid. They see things that ought not to be. They would like to do their job to the best of their ability, but they cannot because this might be stepping on someone's toe. So the lack of talent is a major problem as it relates to public sector efficiency or productivity in the country. The way to address this, of course, is to put people of talent in positions of power. But that goes against the political calculus. It's the same reason the Federation broke up. You want to be the only person with talent in a room. Do you know what I mean? Or running a department or running cabinet. And that's the problem. We don't have a rich tradition of hiring qualified, when I say qualified, competence in getting the job done, not necessarily qualifications per se, serious substantive competence. It's just not part of our tradition, perhaps because, as I said, of the small-mindedness. And this is a major problem. This is the biggest problem. It's not balance of payment issues. Balance of payment issues are a consequence of this problem. We just don't have talent of all kinds: music, politics, arts, science, economics, you name it. The best leave and they take flight. It's a big problem. We were crafting diaspora policy since I was a student at the University of Guyana. Since I was an undergraduate, we have to engage our diaspora. And we do that perhaps on Zoom and in words, but not in any substantive way. There's a lot we can learn in this regard from Israel. They engage the diaspora. They have a great policy of inflow and outflow of talent, not just money. Jews across the world, they don't have lots of money, of course, but they also go there and live. We need to rethink our approach. But we must remember that Guyanese are divided at home across ethnicity, and the diaspora too is equally divided by ethnicity. So you also have to discount. So we have talent abroad, but half of them perhaps are not interested in working with this particular government. So we shoot ourselves in the foot from day one because we haven't settled this major issue.
Is there any path to settling this particular ethnic tension issue in Guyana?
Accounting of the facts. We need to allow independent-minded scholars to put together some data. We need to know. You asked a great question. What's the distribution of wealth across ethnicities? What's the distribution of income across ethnicities? And what's the probability of getting a job and retaining one in government in the private sector across ethnicities? We need to know these things. And of course, the numbers are not going to look good for all players, maybe government, maybe opposition. But then the purpose of this accounting is to chart a way forward, not to cast blame. And that kind of research hasn't been done because the data, for example, the paper I mentioned earlier about inequality across ethnicities in Guyana, I got that data online from the Bureau of Statistics. If you go online now, you can't download the data. It's not there anymore. What's unemployment rate by ethnicity? These are important questions to answer. And so that we can be honest, so that public policy will become less politicized. We need to depoliticize public policy as it relates to distribution across the ethnicities. But that's the everything. That's the elephant in the room. And they don't want to. I'm going to say they, the political class on both sides. Because we had a previous government from 2015 to 2020. You must remember this. They too didn't make any significant steps in this regard. And that's because it has a political logic. You want all the perceptions we have. We want people to keep those perceptions because that's the basis of our political support, those perceptions. And we will reinforce those perceptions at political campaigns. So we're always going to run a race, but with one leg not moving.
Collin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. This has been a very delightful conversation.
Rashid, thanks again for the invitation, and for your listeners, I hope there is some value in this conversation. Thank you very much again.
That's it for this episode. For updates about the podcast, please subscribe to our Substack blog found on cpsi.media. You can also read our newsletters and long-form content on Caribbean policy improvements.